Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of the ICT's premier podcast, Counter-Terrorism Today. I'm Itai Hanman, and it's a pleasure to be here with you as always. On today's episode, we have a very, very special guest joining us. We have Dr. Boaz Ganor, founder and executive director of the International Institute for Counterterrorism, the Ronald Lauder Chair for Counterterrorism at the Reichman University in Herzliya, Israel, as it has been decently changed in the last little while here, so we don't call it the IDC anymore. For anyone that is not up to date, it is now called Reichman University, and it is a wonderful honor for Mr. Reichman and for the school to be named after him that he founded. And now we have Dr. Boaz Ganor, the founder of the ICT, joining us today to speak a little bit about his brand new book, Israel's Counterterrorism Strategy, Origins to the Present. And as well, Dr. Ganor will speak to us a little bit about how the 20th anniversary of the World Summit on Counterterrorism went this past year, with a bit of virtual, with a bit of in-person, a very unique event this year. And Dr. Ganor will summarize and give us some highlights. And we'll look to the future. What is the next year of counterterrorism look like? What does the next year of terrorism look like now with the US out of Afghanistan and new players joining the field of terrorism? And we'll see what Dr. Ganor has to say about that. But now, without further ado, Dr. Boaz Ganor, thank you so much for joining the program. How are you doing?
Very well. Thank you, Itai, for having me in the podcast.
We really appreciate you joining the podcast today. And I'd like to start off by giving you an opportunity to, I guess, summarize a little bit or give us the main highlights of how the World Summit on Counterterrorism went this year. It was the 20th anniversary, so congratulations to you, the Institute, and everyone involved with the putting on of the wonderful World Summit on Counterterrorism. But again, like last year when it had to be canceled due to COVID, new innovative ways had to be brought to the table to make sure that this year, the 20th anniversary, went off without a hitch. And by all accounts, it was one of the best summits that ever was. And it sounds like everyone walked away pleased and enjoyed themselves greatly. So maybe you can give us a bit of highlights from the conference, what you thought was the greatest outcome of the conference this past year, and how you look forward to the conference moving forward now, hopefully with the pandemic a little further behind us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Itai. I agree with you. It was a challenging year. It was a challenging conference, but I think we had a huge accomplishment in achieving a very high level conference altogether. As you have mentioned, we have celebrated actually few anniversaries at the same time. It was the 20th conference, International Conference of ICT, but we also celebrated during the conference the 25th anniversary of the Institute for Counterterrorism, the ICT. And also, as you kindly mentioned at the opening of your statement, we also celebrated the transformation of IDC, the Interdisciplinary Center, into the Reichman University. And practically this was the first event, the first international conference that has been held under the flag, the new flag of Reichman University altogether. Now, you can imagine the challenge of conducting an international conference at that magnitude in one of the peaks of the waves of the COVID-19 crisis. Most of my friends actually recommended me to abandon the idea to conduct a conference altogether, since at that period of time when we started to plan the conference, there was a very probable consequences of having a full siege during the conference. Thanks God it didn't happen. The situation was quite stable, but we couldn't have an in-person participation of the international speakers. So we've conducted the conference in a hybrid manner. in which the Israelis participated in person in the auditorium in front of an Israeli audience and international students which are living in Israel. And the international speakers were practically online, in most cases having an interactive session with panelists on the stage, with the audience, with Q&A, and so on and so forth. You know, when you have a lemon, you need to create a lemonade, and that's what we try to do in this specific conference. And in a retrospective point of view, there was a benefit of that hybrid activity, because we managed to get very high level speakers in the conference that probably would have been difficult for them to fly over to Israel, and they couldn't participate in person. People like the deputy chairman of the UN, the deputy of NATO, the secretary of the DHS, and so on and so forth, from practically all over the world. From Israel's side, we had almost all the Israeli ministers from the Israeli government coming, and of course, our experts and other experts all together. I think that the conference was also very important because there was a clear feeling by all the speakers that the coming year, 2022, is going to be challenging. If we do hope that the coronavirus crisis will, if not end, at least will be limited and would make it possible, together with the vaccination, the ability to return to approximately regular life, as the situation in Israel right now as we speak. It's quite clear that also the terrorists will come up again, and some of them were under the radar during the last 2 years. It was difficult for them to conduct terrorist attacks. They needed to guard their own health, but also it was difficult to cross border. It was difficult to attack crowded places. Now things are going back to normality, and many of the speakers do expect to see what we start to see, the seeds of that, which is the rise of international and domestic terrorism once again, both Islamist jihadist terrorism and far-right terrorism at the same time, simultaneously. That was one of the most important understanding of the conference. And another understanding was the threat of Iran getting stronger, reaching the point almost of no return to become a nuclear power. And no doubt that if and when they would reach that point, as they did in the past, they would use this in order to deter the international community from preventing them in their efforts to conduct terrorist attacks, to interfere in domestic affairs of their neighbors, to threatening Israel and other countries altogether. So we do expect to see even greater involvement of Iran and the proxies of Iran, Hezbollah, Shiite militias, the Houthis in Yemen and others, maybe even a few elements of Al-Qaeda that found shelter in Iran, be much more involved in terrorism in the coming months.
Very interesting that you bring up Iran, as they seem to be in the news all the time for not the best of reasons. And we know that negotiations have not been going well. We know that Foreign Minister Lapid was in a trilateral meeting with Secretary Blinken and the UAE foreign minister just this past week, where Lapid came out pretty forcefully about Iran and what he expects the United States and what he expects the international community to do before Israel were to act on its own. In your quick opinion, does the international community have a chance of reining in Iran in the current strategy format that they have formulated? Or do they need to change tactics? Or is it a lost cause and Israel may have to find a way to save itself?
Thank you for asking this question, Itai. Although we would need the whole podcast just to answer your question, I'll try to be brief. I believe that there is a crucial need. As we speak, actually, the need was years ago, but it's not too late. There is a crucial need to establish an international alliance of states. Let me call it the second NATO alliance of states. As the first NATO was created as an alliance of states that wanted to deter the USSR from attacking Europe, attacking Western countries and other countries altogether. The risk today is becoming more and more clearer and bigger from Iran, that threaten the stability of the neighbor states, threaten to exterminate Israel, and interfere in the domestic affairs of many states all over the world, using proxies for that matter. If Iran would become nuclear, I think that the world stability, the global stability, not even the Middle East stability, or not only the Middle East stability, would be at risk. For that purpose, I think that all the states that share the concern from Iran becoming a nuclear entity, military nuclear entity, they should unite together under the umbrella of the second NATO, and they together should monitor the activity of Iran and should stand against Iran and make it very clear to the Iranians that if they cross the red line, if they manufacture bombs, nuclear bombs, if they threaten to use them against any member state of this alliance, the alliance as one would stand against them and would not hesitate to use military force in order to destroy the regime in Iran. I think that this is a must. I think that the only possibility the Iranians will be deterred from crossing the red line, which is, they are very close to cross the red line, of becoming a military nuclear power, would be if they would be persuaded that there is such kind of an alliance which is motivated and capable to destroy the regime and to attack them if necessary. That might deter them. Nothing else will deter them at that point of time. And you know, in the Second World War, the global strategy was MED, mutual assured destruction, that actually led to some kind of a stability. I don't think that mutual assured destruction will lead to a stability vis-a-vis Iran. We need to adopt another strategy, which I call it IED, which is Iranian assured destruction, that might deter the Iranian regime from crossing the no crossing zone.
Well, the one thing we know is that everyone is a rational player. It's just their own rationale, i.e. their own cost-benefit analysis. We know that Iran does its own cost-benefit analysis, and hopefully with the suggestions such as yours, that would change their cost-benefit analysis, that it just would not be worth their while to develop a nuclear weapon, cross that red line and that threshold. And I guess that's something over the coming year we're going to have to monitor very clearly. We're going to have to watch, as practitioners of counterterrorism, how Iran continues to proliferate the Middle East. It seems that wherever Iran goes, the economic favor of that country seems to sink as well. Look at Lebanon right now. Look at Yemen. Look at Syria. Look at Iraq. Wherever the tentacles of the Iranian octopus seem to reach out to, they destroy and make it worse for the lives of those people in the Middle East. So I think that is a very important strategy. In your coalition idea, would you have some of the Gulf Sunni states be a part of that coalition? And how do you think they would feel being a part of that coalition?
By all means, I think they should be an integral part of this coalition. The coalition should be different from the first NATO. The first NATO was mainly based on European countries, Western European countries, and United States. Those countries should participate in the second NATO as well, but also member states in the second NATO should be Israel on one hand, Gulf countries, few Arab moderate Sunni countries such as Egypt, Jordan, maybe Saudi Arabia. You asked me how would they feel participating in that? I think they would be very happy to join such a alliance. What we see today is quite problematic. This is some kind of checking the water by some of those states which are frustrated from the lack of American motivation and lack of American leadership in the Middle East. It started not with this regime. Even Trump was not showing enthusiasm to deter Iran from their activity, although he stepped out of the nuclear agreement. He didn't do anything else in order to make it clear to the Iranians that the United States would not accept them becoming a nuclear power. But Biden is saying that loud and clear. I'm not so sure that many customers / states in the Middle East today, Sunni Arab countries, allies of United States, really buy that statement. They do hope that it's true, but yet to be seen. It seems that the Americans are once again becoming isolationists, and maybe the only way out, the only solution for those countries is to participate in such an alliance, because the alternative is actually to surrender to Iran and send reconciliation missions and delegations from those countries to Tehran, paying the respect and getting and accepting the growing hegemony of Iran in the Middle East, which of course will risk their independence by doing that. But they are afraid, they are concerned, and we see that they are checking all possibilities right now. And that's the time for United States, that's the time for the international community to step ahead and to do something that would make it clear to all regional states and powers that what used to be is no more going to be the same thing. We are all determined to prevent Iran from becoming nuclear.
And as you mentioned, I think it's very interesting that you mentioned the United States is becoming more isolationist, and you can look at that specifically through the lens of the Afghanistan withdrawal, and we can talk about what the repercussions for that will be. There could be many podcasts just specifically on that, obviously. But I did want to ask you that if there is this fear of lack of American leadership in the Middle East, but there is the mutual fear of what Iran will do as it continues to grow its hegemonic power across the region. Would these Gulf Sunni states, for example, that you made mention of, as well as moderate Arab states like Egypt and Jordan, would they be okay with a coalition of them and Israel, for example? Would they be okay with Israel being the tip of the spear and they're a part of a coalition led by Israel, or is it still not acceptable to have a military alliance with Israel vis-a-vis a Shiite Arab state or Shiite Muslim state?
So until that point in the podcast, I was quite pessimistic, but now let me share with you some optimistic point of view. I think that the ecosystem in the Middle East is changing positively from an Israeli point of view. The Abrams Agreement started a process which is unprecedented. Not only the fact that some of those countries signed a peace agreement with Israel, it's first time ever, probably what we call a warm peace, a peace that also involve exchange of tourists and goods and economical initiatives and so on and so forth. We didn't have that for decades with Egypt. We had it for a short period of time with Jordan, but now the Abraham Accords actually is really changing the whole atmosphere in the Middle East. And I think that this alliance, as said, would solve some of the existential problems of those countries of the Abraham Agreement and those regimes. So not only that they would agree to join forces with Israel and to participate with Israel in this alliance, they would be very happy to do so, and they would be happy if Israel will take, I wouldn't say the lead in the alliance, but an active and important role, because they do understand that Israel is committed to the same goal that they have. I'm not so sure that they believe that United States is as committed, definitely not Europe, is committed to the same goal.
So in your opinion, this isn't just a situation of the friend of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This is more of actual friendship that has been developed through the Abraham Accords. And as we have seen in the first 6 months of 2021, economic statements have shown $650 billion worth of economic trade between the UAE and Israel alone. That is quite incredible. We're seeing, as you mentioned, the warm peace between these two nations specifically, and Bahrain as well, really, really flourish. And as they continue to flourish, hopefully trust can be built and a coalition can be built to face off against Iran, because as you mentioned, I do not believe a lot of these countries have faith in the commitment of the United States, and definitely not of Europe. And as we look at the waning confidence that they may have in the United States, we look at the withdrawal of Afghanistan. And the withdrawal of Afghanistan, we've spoken at length about it on this podcast, and it has been written about and spoken about all over the world. It was tactically a failure of immense magnitude. However, we did learn in the newspapers this past week that Israeli special forces flew out a couple hundred Afghanistan civilians that needed to be flown out of Afghanistan on secret missions. Israel participated to help them out there. So that was quite heartwarming to read, that even Israel participated in airlifts of Afghanistan personnel out of Afghanistan as things went south there. And as things went south there, we saw the Taliban come out of the caves and really take over all over Afghanistan once again. And that seems like it might give a free hand to Al Qaeda. And as we look to the future and to the next year, do you think that the fall of Afghanistan to the hands of the Taliban once again will lead to a stronger, more centralized Al Qaeda?
In short, the answer is positive. Although we do hear the spokesperson of the Taliban saying that what used to be is not going to be in the future, i.e. they are not going to let any terrorist organization, let alone Al-Qaeda, be rooted again in their territory. I think the best case scenario is this is the wishful thinking. Probably they don't even try to persuade themselves in that statement. They just want to calm down the Americans and the international community, but they practically cannot prevent from Al-Qaeda to be rooted in their territory. It's very difficult to distinguish between the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda supporters and activists. Sometimes it's the same people from the same family. And therefore, I do believe that Al-Qaeda will be strengthened on their territory. But the real question, in my view, is what will be the position and the strategy that will be taken by the immediate neighbors of Afghanistan, especially China, Russia, maybe Pakistan and Tajikistan and other countries along the line. Now, let me share with you an anecdote. A few months before 9/11, 2001, I was giving a talk in Beijing. The talk was for the Military Academy of China. And I decided to speak about Al-Qaeda, although it was not a very known organization to the public before 9/11, but they knew about the organization, we knew, and I shared with them my assessment about the organization. When I finished my lecture, one of the Chinese officers raised his hand, and he's saying to me, my young friend, emphasize the term young, not because he wanted to compliment me. He said, my young friend, for the last hour you were speaking about Al-Qaeda, but you failed to mention two important facts which are needed to be said when you describe this phenomenon of Al-Qaeda. I knew he was leading me, but I said, okay, what did I miss? He said, the first fact is who created Al-Qaeda? He said, who do you think created Al-Qaeda? I said, United States, don't you know it? He was referring to the fact that United States, of course, supported some extremists and extreme elements that were fighting against the USSR and against the Soviet troops there. And for him, it was a clear cut that United States created Al-Qaeda. My answer to him was, I think you got it all wrong. United States didn't create Al-Qaeda. United States made an enormous mistake, as many other states, by the way, including Israel, falling into the false belief that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and then wake up to learn that the enemy of my enemy is the worst enemy of mine. But then I've asked him, what is the second fact that I've missed? And then he took me by surprise. He said, why did United States create Al-Qaeda? And I said, why do you think United States created Al-Qaeda? He said, in order to attack China. Don't you get it? And he was referring to the operational connections that Al-Qaeda used to have with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, in the western side of China. And for him, it was all clear cut. United States created this terrorist organization in order to support the Uyghurs fighting against China. And it's all a plot, American plot against China. I'm saying that because I'm quite convinced that China will have a vital interest in taking control, at least on the eastern side of Afghanistan, in order to see to it that there will not be any operational ties between extremists in Afghanistan and the Uyghurs. And for that purpose, you might see China much more involved in the overall and developing relations with the Taliban regime, maybe even do some economical investments there in return for natural resources that you have in Afghanistan. That's China. Russia, bear in mind, kept on interests in Afghanistan, and they would definitely look into it. Iran would be very interested to be involved as well, and they have some kind of connection, which is the few very important leaders of Al-Qaeda that found shelter in Iran, fled away to Iran after the American invasion to Afghanistan, and they lived there for decades, and they might serve as a mediator between Iran and the Taliban regime as well. Pakistan as well, of course, have interest and see the clashes in the Pakistani border. ISIS also didn't say the last word, and we see attacks being conducted there, and they might try to find the vacuum or some part of the vacuum which is being created in Afghanistan in order to be rooted in different part, maybe in the territory which is close to Pakistan. So this region is far from stability, and I think that it would not only risk the local neighbors of Afghanistan, but actually the global arena as well.
Very interesting, as I think there is a lot to dissect there, as the fear that Afghanistan could turn into another Syria, in a sense of world powers clashing in one little location with a bunch of terrorist organizations as well, is a real possibility, except it's not Turkey, Russia, and Iran in Syria. It'll be Pakistan, China, Russia, Iran, and anyone else you mentioned inside of Afghanistan. And it seems like the poor Afghani people will not get a break from war. Since the 1970s, it has just been year after year of war. If it was the Soviet Union, it was the Americans, it was the Mujahideen, it was Al Qaeda, it was the Taliban, it was whoever you wanted. The Afghanistan people seem to be suffering, and at the end of the day, they're the ones that will continue to suffer the most from this. I just wanted to quickly ask you before we move on to your book, and you give us a little bit of an overview and everything to do with the book. Do you think that the way Afghanistan fell, does this give rise again to the ability of centralized terrorist organizations? Because what we saw with Al Qaeda since the fall of Afghanistan the first time round was a very decentralized way of operating. There was still some word from headquarters to other groups, but we saw Al Qaeda pop up in many different regions and sort of have a little bit more autonomy from their headquarters. With the fall of a lot of ISIS territories, we saw them decentralized in a little bit of a way as well. Will the rise of the Taliban give them the ability to centralize again? And if they're centralized, does that make them more powerful or less powerful?
It's an interesting question. Bear in mind that Al Qaeda evolved through the time. At first, it was also a very centralized organization. Only after they were the autonomous territory, or the territory that they control in Afghanistan, was taken by the American-led coalition, they were forced to change their structure and their modus operandi and rely on franchise much more than a central Al-Qaeda activity using those proxies in different parts of the world. Yes, right now, I think that there would be an opportunity for Al-Qaeda to return to the center of the global jihadist arena. I think that they would try to be more centralized than they used to be before. It would not be, instead of the efforts to keep on presence in different parts of the world, in North Africa, in Syria, in other parts of Africa, Central Africa, and Kashmir and other places altogether. But they will try to reorganize, because for the last few years, they didn't have the upper end. The upper end was ISIS. ISIS now created a vacuum, and Al-Qaeda would probably try to fill into it. But I think that the main concerning message from the situation in Afghanistan is the lack of appetite of the Americans, of United States, and other states to be involved in conflict areas like Afghanistan in the near future, because they bear the scratches and the suffering and the losses that they had monetarily wise, and people that they lost, soldiers that they lost in mind. So that might lead to the creation of other ungoverned territory that will be taken by extremist Islamist jihadists from Al-Qaeda and from ISIS, maybe other organizations as well.
Fair enough. Very interesting analysis there, Dr. Ganor. But we are up against the clock, and I don't want to not have the opportunity to discuss with you your latest book, Israel's Counterterrorism Strategy, Origins to the Present. Maybe you can give us a brief highlight of the book, how you came up with the idea, what was the reason behind wanting to write it, and how you feel it came out at the end of the day.
Thank you for that, Itai. Well, I would start with a warm recommendation to our viewers and listeners to read the book, because I definitely cannot summarize that in the few minutes that we have together, because this book actually reflects a very long research that I've conducted. The research started a few decades ago. My PhD dissertation was also designated to the strategy of Israeli counterterrorism. But then I elaborated that in the book much more. Think about it. Israel is one of the few democracies in the world that suffer from the phenomenon of terrorism for so long. Actually, from the day of independence in 1948 up till this very moment. And if we think about it, even before the Independence Day, the Jewish community in Palestine before the creation of Israel was also suffering from terrorist attacks altogether. Israel suffered from a variety of perpetrators, organized terrorists, hybrid terrorist organizations, lone wolves, the individual attackers, networks that conducted the attack, Shiite terrorist organization, global terrorist organization, Palestinian nationalists, Palestinian Islamists, you name it, we had it. This is another thing that makes Israel quite knowledgeable about this situation. Israel has suffered from all types of modus operandi that terrorists are using, going from hostage barricade situation, kidnapping, shooting at, bombing attacks, suicide attacks, you name it. Israel suffered from domestic terrorism in its own territory, from cross-border terrorism, and from international terrorism against Israeli and Jewish targets all over the world. Really, there is no precedent of a state that suffered from such a variety and that amount of terrorist attacks, and therefore accumulated a lot of knowledge and quite a lot of know-how, and also developed innovative countermeasures and innovative technology in order to contend with this phenomenon. I describe in the book that is divided chronologically from 48 to different eras and different challenges that Israel has faced. And I describe how Israel have dealt with that, and how Israel created what I call the art of counterterrorism, which is the art of finding the right balance between contradictive constraints. For example, think about what we call the democratic dilemma in counterterrorism. This is something that Israel, in my view, is a world leader in finding the balance between the two. What does it mean? How do you become effective in counterterrorism as a liberal democracy and guarding at the same time your liberal democratic values? Like it or not, there is a contradiction between the two. Israel is struggling with this contradiction for so many years, still struggling today, sometimes finding good solutions, sometimes not that good solutions. Questions that has to do with distinctive activity, prevention of collateral damage, proportionality. All of those subject matters are being dealt in Israel and is being dealt in the book as well. Israel, I would argue, and I would sum up with that, in a way is the Western countries' laboratory for effective and balanced counterterrorism activity. You know, when I travel around the world, sometimes my colleagues, my friends are almost dismissing the Israeli knowledge in counterterrorism because they're saying, you know, the Israeli situation is very unique. There is a situation of nationalist confrontation between the Palestinians and the Israelis, occupation, and so on and so forth. We can not learn anything from the Israeli experience because this experience is very different from our experience, and I beg to differ. Although the motivation in some cases might be different, the modus operandi that the terrorists are using is the same modus operandi, and you can hardly find any state that has marched such a long march in contending with this phenomenon like Israel. And I do hope that the readers would find interest in the Israeli innovation in counterterrorism and decide what they can take from the book and adopt in their home countries, and what is really not necessary for them to do, and also to learn from the Israeli mistakes, which some of them are being described in the book as well.
It's a very extensive and elaborate book, and as you mentioned, in chronological order from the origins of the state to today. Before we let you go, I really would like to know what you may have found as the biggest challenge in writing such an extensive, elaborate book. There's so much information, there's so much history to dig into, research to look into, deciding on what should go in, what shouldn't go in. What did you find is the biggest challenge in writing such an extensive, elaborate book?
It's an interesting question. First of all, as you mentioned, to encapsulate so many things and to decide what is really important to analyze and what we can leave for maybe other articles that will be written in the future, that was very difficult. But I think that what I try to do in an objective way, as much as possible, because I'm an Israeli and I'm writing on Israeli affairs, but being a scholar, I have the obligation to be as objective as I can. I try to give the right impression to the reader on the difficulty that Israel has in balancing between its commitment to its citizens to protect them from terrorism and its commitment to the liberal democratic values that we have. You know, my intention was to have another title for the book, and I had a discussion with the editor. At the end of the day, I agreed to the title of the book, The Israeli Counterterrorism Strategy, which was suggested by the editor. But I wanted to call the book The Shackled Goliath. And I think that the term actually explains this essence. Israel seems to be a Goliath in the region, almost a regional superpower with outstanding technology, with a lot of resources, fighting against the so-called David terrorist organization, very small, very weak, and so on and so forth. But this is a shackled Goliath fighting against a lunatic David. It's not really a lunatic, but is really turn a blind eye to any constraints, to any moral international standards altogether, and he misused them against the shackled Goliath. Now try to fight with your hands cuffed behind your back and your legs being shackled against this type of terrorist organization, and then you might start to understand what is the real challenge that Israel is facing in its counterterrorism strategy.
Very interesting, and I have to say I really like the name The Shackled Goliath. That seems like a very appropriate name for the book or for another book into the future. But Dr. Ganor, where can our audience go to find this wonderful book?
Well, it's quite easy. It's being sold online and every online platform. The strategy, the Israeli strategy of counterterrorism. And in any case, they are also all invited, our listeners, next September to come and visit us in hopefully in the next in-person international conference. And then they probably might buy it in Israel as well. I'd be more than happy to sign it for your viewers and listeners.
Excellent. That's wonderful to hear. For anyone that caught in late to the program today, we have had Dr. Boaz Ganor, founder and executive director of the International Institute for Counterterrorism, the Ronald Lauder Chair for Counterterrorism at the Reichman University, formerly known as the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, Israel. We spoke about the future of counterterrorism, the fall of Al Qaeda, and the rise of Al Qaeda again to be in Afghanistan. We looked at Iran and highlights of the World Summit on Counterterrorism, which was an amazing event that took place in September 11th. As always, it was the 20th anniversary for that and a couple of other very important anniversaries that we spoke with Dr. Ganor about. 25th anniversary of the founding of the ICT, which is an incredible feat. Dr. Ganor, thank you so much for taking the time to join the program and explain about your book and your thoughts on the future of counterterrorism over the next year. And we wish you all the best. We wish all the luck in the world to the ICT and hopefully an in-person event for 2022 at the next World Summit for Counterterrorism. Thank you, Dr. Ganor, for taking the time.
Thank you for having me, Itai.